This is Support is Sexy, episode 496, with career coach Susan Peppercorn, founder of Positive Workplace Partners. Welcome to Support is Sexy. I'm your host, Elayne Fluker, entrepreneur, author, and founder of Chic Rebellion Media. 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, I bring you inspiring women entrepreneurs who share their wins and lessons to help you take your business to the next level. Here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Support is Sexy. I'm happy to have you here. You know, it just would not be the same without you. And if you are a woman entrepreneur who is ready to step into the spotlight, to really get your message out there, share your message with the world in a strategic, smart, and authentic way, I want you to consider podcast guesting. Podcast guesting is one of the great ways right now to really get your message out there. Instead of starting your own podcast, be a guest and reach new audiences again and again. Now, if you're interested in figuring out how to do that and be an unforgettable podcast guest, just download my free guide at girlonpodcastgift.com. That's girlonpodcastgift.com. Learn how to be an unforgettable podcast guest and reach new audiences again and again. Now, if you are someone who, whether an entrepreneur, of course, which a lot of you are, or if you're in a career, this episode is excellent for you because we speak to Susan Peppercorn from Positive Workplace Partners, and Susan gives such great advice on how to navigate those sticky points in, not even in your career, it's more about relationships. I spoke to her a lot. Actually, I'll tell you, I like to make things personal sometimes. This time, though, it wasn't actually me. I was thinking about a friend of mine who is a very high-level executive in a big organization, and she is going through a sticky, as I said, time with some other people, or really one other person in her organization. I won't say her name because she'll kill me, but I was thinking about her as Susan was giving her advice, and it's such great advice on how to navigate these kind of circumstances where, for whatever reason, there might be a conflict in the workplace, or figuring out, we also talk about whether you're even happy in the workplace or happy at your job. Also, Susan talks about 5 key questions to ask yourself in order to help you ditch your inner critic, which obviously can also affect us at work, in our workplace, and whatever kind of work we do in our business. We also talk about breaking down your goals, the lean startup model, so many things that I think are going to be exceptionally helpful to you in navigating whatever sticky situations, or just maybe you'll hear this and be like, yep, I do that. I'm right on point. That's all good too. But I'm confident that you will get great information from Susan in this episode. And I'm going to make sure to share this with my friend because I thought about her and used her as my question inspiration the entire time. All right. So now, without further ado, Susan Peppercorn. So Susan, thank you so much for joining us for an episode of Support is Sexy. I'm excited to chat with you.
Well, Elayne, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Of course. I have a lot of good questions for you.
I bet you do.
So our first one, when did you first fall in love with entrepreneurship?
Well, I fell in love with entrepreneurship when I realized that I had something unique of value to offer, and I was excited to put it out there.
So what was it that was the turning point for you in realizing that you had something unique to offer? Were you in search mode, kind of looking for what is that thing, or did it sort of occur to you through something else?
Well, it actually took me a while. I didn't start out planning to be an entrepreneur. I worked in the corporate world for a long, long time. And it was only when I felt that I had enough financial stability, and also that when I had enough confidence, did I decide to turn to entrepreneurship. So it was those things combined. And in the work that I do, I realized, in the kind of career coaching that I do, I realize that what I do is somewhat unique, but only having done it after a number of years, I realized that there were not a lot of people doing what I do. And I decided, well, it's really about time that I market it as my business and stop kind of dipping my toe in without really not being committed.
Thank you for mentioning too that it sounds like you sort of discovered your sweet spot, as they say, over time. Sometimes I think a lot of us wait forever and ever until we think we're going to just land on what that sweet spot is without trying different things or experimenting or dipping our toe in, as you said.
I think it's really important, to experiment. I don't know whether you've ever mentioned, there's a concept for startup entrepreneurs, and I'm actually, I'll think of the term in a minute, but, it used to be develop the business plan.
Oh, the lean startup? Are you talking about?
Yes, thank you.
Oh my goodness, I'm reading that book right now, Susan, by Eric Ries. Yes.
Right, and it's really iterate as you go along. So it used to be in the startup world, develop the business plan and get it perfect, and it's really not how it's done anymore. It's really this lean concept of lean startup canvas, where you put something out there and then you see how it goes, and then you adjust as you see how the market reacts. And I think that's really, really important. It's important whether you're looking for a job or whether you're starting your own business, because until you put something out there, you're not going to know for sure whether it's going to work or not. And that's really what happened with my business. I started, I adjusted, I listened to what clients were telling me, I looked at what my competition was doing, and then I just kept modifying and adjusting and listening and adjusting, and that's how I think that's how it became very successful for me, was really through that iterative process.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. And as he talks about in the book, The Lean Startup, which everyone, of course, I'll link to if you haven't heard of it. But the idea of just what you just explained so eloquently, the idea of creating this feedback loop. So putting something out there, getting feedback, then iterating, putting something out there, getting feedback and iterating, and how important that is. And I think, what do you think, Susan? I think it's even, I won't say more important, but I'm happy that we're sharing this, especially with women entrepreneurs, because I think a lot of us sometimes as women can really get stuck on this idea of it has to be perfect for me to even try.
Absolutely. And, that's really the topic of my book too, which is, ditch your inner critic at work, which is relevant for entrepreneurs as much as it is for anybody in a career. And I do think that women, more than men, and I coach both, think that they have to have, 90% perfected before they'll go out there, and men not so much.
Right.
And it's really not the case. I mean, you just can't know everything before you go out there and try something. Now, there are things you can do to test, and I'm not saying you should just, go out there without testing the market ahead of time. But, there's a difference between excellence and perfectionism. And excellence you can measure, perfect you can't.
Right. Perfect is subjective, right?
Exactly.
I think too, just as you mentioned, I always tell people, remember, most men don't really worry about the knowledge gap. They're like, oh, I'll figure it out.
That's
Whereas
right.
we like to make sure we're 150% sure of it. And you don't know what you don't know, right?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
There's a difference. I'm writing that down. That's a good one. I might have to frame that. Difference between excellence and perfectionism. So now tell us, Susan, about you, where you grew up and what you were like as a young woman.
So I grew up in Queens, New York.
My family's from Queens.
You're kidding.
Yes.
Wow. So
Jamaica, Queens. Yes.
Well, I grew up in Flushing, which is not far from Jamaica, Queens. So it's the lower middle class section of New York City. And I'm a classically trained musician. And I spent the bulk of my career in high-tech sales. Until it sucked the life out of me. And I found my passion actually later in my career. And so that's why I've devoted my career to helping others find their passion, because I didn't want it to take other people as long as it took me. So that's my background in a nutshell.
Yes. Now you spent 20 years, if I read this right, 20 years in business development before you sort of made the shift, right? And you were drawn to positive psychology.
Yes.
What drew you in that direction specifically?
So, what I love about positive psychology is that it is based in science. And what I often say, and this is true, is I probably supported the self-help industry single-handedly. So before I was introduced to the science of positive psychology, I would buy self-help books, and I have nothing against them. I think they're wonderful. But the difference for me was that I'd read a self-help book and then I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And what really made the difference is when I studied positive psychology is it's based upon social science research, mostly done by psychologists, some done by neuroscientists. And it's research that most people don't know about because it's written about in journals. And the average journal publication is read by about 7 or 8 people, including the author's parents.
Right.
So when I became exposed to some of this, the research that's written in journals, it's quite extraordinary because it's all practical, and it really looks at how people thrive. And that's what the research is based on. And so for me, it wasn't just about do this because I say so and you'll be happier. It was do this because the science shows that if you do these things, you are more likely to, feel a greater sense of satisfaction, or be happier in your life. And so I actually started to do some of these practices that I learned about in my own study of positive psychology. And so since it made a difference to me in my own life, I started incorporating some of these practices with my own clients. And lo and behold, I was amazed at the results. And so the more that I learned, the more I wanted to learn, the more I wanted to share with my clients. And so I've incorporated much of that into my own coaching. And that's also why I wrote my book.
Why would you say that coaching for career women and for women entrepreneurs is critical to our happiness and wellness and overall success?
Well, it's kind of like sports coaching. So if anyone has ever played a sport or out there and has, have worked with, a teacher of whatever instrument you play, it really helps to have someone point out your strengths, hold you accountable, and keep you on track. And that's what a coach does. So it's not that you can't do these things by yourself, but it's a lot easier to do it with the support of someone else. And that's really what a coach does, for a woman entrepreneur. And even coaches, what I say oftentimes is coaches hire coaches.
Right.
When they have something difficult to achieve. And I have done so, for myself and have found it extremely valuable.
That's right. The psychiatrist has a psychiatrist. The psychologist has a psychologist. And the hairstylist has a hairstylist. That's right. I love the use of sports too, because I usually say to people, champions have coaches.
That's
They're
right.
not out there winning games by themselves. And usually, even you think of Olympic athletes, when they want to get better, they go back to their coach or they get a new coach. So
that's right.
That's right.
Exactly.
If you want to be a champion. Now, I read that you specialize in working with individuals who are, quote unquote, in career transitions and find themselves at a crossroads. And I think a lot of us, for whatever reason, different reasons at different stages of our lives, careers, and businesses certainly find ourselves at these crossroads. Mm-hmm. So what would you say, is the first thing we should do when we find ourselves not even just at a crossroads, but maybe stuck at the crossroads?
I think the most important thing to do is to identify one action that you can take to move forward. I think what happens is we overwhelm ourselves. So we think about what the end goal might be. It's like, well, I have to start my business. Mm-hmm. Okay, but if we say I have to start my business, that might involve 100 steps. Okay, but if we think of the 100 steps, we get overwhelmed. So by the time we think about 100 steps, they're like, oh my God, forget about it. It's just too much. So instead, just say, what's one step that I can take? Maybe it's, updating your resume. Maybe it's inviting someone to coffee who started a business to learn about how they got started. Maybe it's attending a professional event, a networking event. It doesn't matter what that step is. It's just one step, because what happens is if you take one step, then you can take the next step, then you can take the next step. But we sabotage ourselves by not breaking the steps down into small enough chunks. And by breaking it into small enough chunks, when we do, it becomes manageable. And then we get motivated. When we do one step, we get motivated to do the next one and the next one and the next one. So that would be my advice.
That's great. And I think it's when you're at a crossroads, but also as you were talking, I was thinking about sometimes, and I've felt like this in the past, but I think I have adopted the step-by-step model now. But when you hear people say, coaches or whoever, think about the big vision, the big goal, dream big. We all have our vision boards. I'm looking at mine, this big ideal of whatever we want to create in our lives. It is big, it feels big and all that. And then people, again, feel stuck like, okay, how do I get there? Which I always say, let go of the how, what now, et cetera. But I think even that applies to taking what's the first step? Like you said, breaking it down into little pieces, do you think?
Yes, because actually, one of the things that coaches learn when they're trained is to help clients break down whatever it is they're trying to achieve into manageable steps. And in every coaching meeting, one of the goals is to identify an agenda for that particular meeting, as well as what the next steps are going to be before the next meeting, so that it's always very clear to the client and to the coach what they're working on. And, I often use the analogy of a diet. If somebody, why do people, have trouble dieting? Well, obvious, I'm simplifying this, but, if you have to lose 50 pounds or you want to lose 50 pounds, you don't do that all at once. You lose a pound a week. So how do you lose a pound a week? By focusing on the 1 pound a week.
Right.
So if you think about the 50 pounds, it's overwhelming. It's like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get there? It's true of any goal you're trying to achieve. So if you're starting a business and you need a website, well, focus on what do you have to do to get that website up, if you're going to do it yourself, how are you going to do it? If you're going to hire a designer, how do you find the designer? Are you going to lay out the structure for the website? Who can help you with that? That's a tangible goal. If you're not sure how to do that, who can you network with to find out the best way to go about it? That's a manageable goal. But you can't get a business up and running with all the possible things that you need unless you break it down into those manageable steps. And then you're not beating yourself up for not doing all of those hundreds and thousands of things.
Right. Instead, you're celebrating the one thing that you did do.
Exactly. That's right.
Yes, that's so good. That's so good. Yes, you're so right. So now on your website, positiveworkplacepartners.com, you have an incredible career fit assessment that includes 60 questions from your book, right? Ditch Your Inner Critic at Work, which is everyone, of course, will have links to it. But I got to tell you, I looked at it. Can't wait to fill it out. Incredible questions. So I want to ask you, not all of the questions, obviously, but why some of the following areas or questions are important. That's what we're going to go through next. Okay, so the first one I looked at, the question was, does your work feed your spirit as well as your bank account? Why is that question important?
Because a lot of times we confuse what we think is going to make us happy with what really makes us happy. And again, what science has shown is that money doesn't buy us happiness. It does until a certain level. So we need a certain amount of money. We need to keep a roof over our head and food on the table, and those things that obviously are important. But beyond that level, the more money we make or the more promotions we get or the fancier cars we buy does not buy us more happiness. And it's really whether the work that we do feeds our spirit. is a determinant of whether we're going to be happy at what we're doing, be it entrepreneurial or a job. And that's why that question is there.
I've read that, and I don't know if this is true, so sir, I'm trusting you know much more about this than me, that people say after, is it $70,000
Yes,
in the U,
that's
right?
right.
After
Mm-hmm.
that amount, the happiness doesn't change. And some people
That's right.
find that impossible because you think, oh, the more money I would have, the happier I would be, but not based on the science, right?
That's correct. Absolutely right.
Mm-hmm. So the next question I saw, my manager's attitude toward failure can be best described as blank. And I was curious about this question because it wasn't even just the manager's attitude toward failure is important.
So we know that if we're working in a company or in an organization, how we are treated by our manager and the culture of that organization is so critical to our success. So if a manager expects that failure is part of life and is part of learning, then you're probably in a good place. But if the manager does not understand that and is highly critical if you have a setback, then you may be in the wrong job. And I've seen this with clients that I've coached where, like, my manager is so critical, they embarrass me in front of other people. You know, if something goes wrong, they'll say something at a staff meeting, those kinds of situations where a manager may be highly critical are toxic environments.
Right.
And then what's important to realize is, unless you can transfer inside of the company, you may have to look elsewhere because you can't change your manager. If that's the style of the manager, if they are empowered, then you have to realize what you can change and what you can't change. So unless you can just adopt an attitude where you let these things slide off your back, if you have a manager who is highly critical, which is really tough to do, then you may have to realize that the environment is not supportive of what you need. And that's why that question is there.
Will the same be true, Susan, if it's a colleague who is at the same, level position wise as you, but has become an environment that is, as you said, toxic? And I ask this because I have a friend who's a high level executive at a huge company. She's been there for many years, very successful. A new woman has come in. Well, I guess she's not new that much anymore, but it's been this constant battle between my friend and this woman and then other team members. So she and I always discuss the kind of conflicts they have, and they've involved HR, and it's been all these other things that you try to do to remedy the situation. But I know it's not only stressing her out so much, but because she loves her job so much, and now this other conflict has come there. So it's not necessarily the attitude toward failure like this question, but I think you mentioned about just having to consider some other options if it really becomes toxic.
And those situations can happen. It's very, very sad when that happens. But, if your friend has tried to resolve this situation and the other person, for whatever reason, is unwilling or unable to meet her halfway, or just cannot see the situation for what it is, then your friend may have to develop some options for herself. Because, at some point when you can't control someone else, you have to ask yourself, do you want to be miserable, or, do you want to look for an alternative? It doesn't always mean that you have to leave the company, but maybe there's something else in the company that you can pursue instead.
Where you're not necessarily working as closely with that person.
Exactly.
Oh, I see. I'm going to thank you for, you got to send me an invoice. Thank you for that. And I'll send it to her. No, that's great because she really, I do this occasionally during podcasts. Everyone knows I always say, this is a selfish question, but this was just based on your poignant answer about the toxic relationships. But I know for her, especially, like I said, she loves her job and she gets contacted by recruiters all the time. She's really great at what she does, etc. So she still, though, doesn't want to leave. That's how I know she really loves it. But to your point, maybe there's other areas in the company that she can go work within.
And also, she should talk to recruiters because, if she found another option or if she entertained some other options, she might go back to her management and say, look, this situation has become untenable. I have, there are some outside opportunities that I have, looked at, and I want to stay here, but you have to help me to stay here. And this is what I need to stay here.
Mm-hmm.
And looks at some things outside, doesn't mean she has to take them.
Right.
But, if she creates options for herself, she could then go back to management. I actually had this conversation with a client today because she was ready to leave a situation that she's in. She's not in a toxic situation, but she's in a situation where she'd like to do some things, like to have more of a strategic role.
Mm-hmm.
And she's really in a total operational role. And it came out in the course of conversation that she hasn't asked to play more of a strategic role. And so I just suggested to her, look, before you leave, before you move your family,
right,
why don't you ask for it? You never know. Because she's also very well respected. I mean, if you're not well respected, if you're not well liked, that's a different story.
right.
But if you are, well, why don't you at least try to ask for it?
That's such a good point for your client. And then my friend, she's a rock star in this company, this organization. So, yeah.
And this is, again, with women tend to, hold back. They tend to say, well, I don't want to be, pushy. I don't want to be perceived as being bitchy, pushy. I don't want to be the troublemaker.
Right. I'll just leave and find something else. Right.
And, my point to my client today is you have earned the right. You are highly respected. You are highly thought of inside of your organization. You have earned the right. Ask for what you have earned.
So powerful. Thank you, Susan. Honestly,
Sure.
You send me that invoice, I'll forward it to you.
Okay.
No, that's excellent advice. I'm sure everyone listening that probably resonated, whether for yourself, your friend, whoever, know this information for even future circumstance, because it happens. It definitely happens.
Yes.
All right. Question number 3. How strong is your inner critic?
So that question is there because dealing with an inner critic starts with self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And how would you know if your inner critic is getting in the way of your success, of your happiness, or anything else, unless you're aware it's there. And so you can't deal with it unless you know. And that's why the question is asking you to take stock of where you are. Do you know? Do you have an inner critic? And how strong is it?
Right. And we should mention, I don't know if I did this in the beginning, I got so into my own questions for my friend, but under each of these that I'm mentioning here, questions or areas, you have several different choices. And then, yes, then a summary of based on your responses, this is what you should consider, or this is
yes.
Okay. Just so everybody knows that these are a few and there's plenty others underneath for each one to help you kind of think through them.
Right.
Yes. So number 4, think back to one of your career decisions that did not work out the way you thought it would. I thought that was powerful. Why do we need to consider that?
Because a lot of times, and this happened in my career, and I actually talk about some failures and a gigantic failure that I had. At the time, when we have a failure and we think, oh my gosh, this is earth-shattering, it's a disaster. Sometimes in retrospect, it's not as bad as we think it's going to be at the time that it happens. Mm-hmm. And that's really why that question is there, because sometimes a question that I'll ask a client, I work with some of my clients have been laid off from their jobs, and most of the time it has nothing to do with their performance. It has to do with corporate reorganizations. And so a question I'll ask them is, how will you feel about this 3 years from now? Because if you can imagine 3 years from now, it puts a different perspective on it than today. And so that's the reason that question is there, is to think back over a decision that didn't work out the way you had hoped it would or the way you thought that it would. And then really, was it better than did it work out better than you thought it would? Did it work out worse than you thought it would? Because sometimes we think it's going to be one way, but it turns out to be another way.
Right. Now, what about you for the failure that you mentioned that you share in your book, Your Inner Critic at Work? Was it something, that was from your career or personal? Okay.
Yes, it was something from my career. And at the time it was devastating. And, I really thought it was going to bring my career to a screeching halt. Mm-hmm. What I realized from it, though, I was very early on in my career, and in retrospect, what I realized is that the management that I worked for did not provide me with the training nor the support that I needed at the time. And this is really interesting for your listeners, because I was in a company, and diversity hiring was very important to them. So I was one of the first women promoted into a sales management role. Mm-hmm. And at the time that this incident occurred, I was probably 25 or 26 years old, and my clients were double my age. And so I really did not have the background to be dealing with corporate clients in very complicated political situations. And, afterwards, when I thought about what happened, and this was way after it happened, I thought, my management that was way more experienced than I was should have sat me down. And, they should have said, hey, look, Susan, this was, really unfortunate, which it was. And I did make mistakes. And they should have said, okay, let's talk about how to prevent something like this from happening again. Mm-hmm. But instead, the attitude was like, okay, you either fix it or you're out of here. It was just very binary. And I had to figure it out by myself, which, when I think about it, I did figure it out, which was incredible, a testament to my own persistence and perseverance, but not in any way could I credit the people around me in my organization, my management. They were running for the hills. They didn't want to have anything. They wanted no association with this. And that was really sad. And I realized that as a young woman in a predominantly male environment, I felt totally alone and abandoned.
That's what I was thinking as you were telling the story. It feels isolating.
Totally isolating. Mm-hmm. Totally isolating. And it was ugly. It was hideous. It made me stronger. Everything that I know about corporate politics, I learned from this incident and some others. But boy, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy.
Yeah, because it sounds like it was hurtful too. I've been through different things, career-wise, business, and like you said, they make us stronger in the end, and especially when you can take that view. How will this, feel 3 years from now? But still, I think for the women listening to be able to acknowledge if it hurts your feelings or it hurts, you feel disappointed or certainly feeling isolated as you did, that no one's supporting you in that moment.
Well, and also there were no women role models.
Right.
There were no women in senior management roles, so there were no women for me to go to. Mm-hmm. And, part of why I do what I do now, and I also mentor groups of women, is because I don't want women to have to figure it out by themselves. I want them to understand that there are women out there who can provide this level of support. And I actually mentor women who don't work for the same company, because I think it's a lot easier for women to mentor women when they're not in the same organization. They don't have to worry about what they say to each other.
Right.
But it was a very lonely and isolating experience.
Well, thank you for sharing it with us here and sharing it in your book, that Your Inner Critic at Work. So I'm sure people will love to hear more about that. Now, I want to ask that it's not the last question. There are 6 questions. The last question on my list: how do you define happiness?
So the first thing I want to say about happiness is happiness, when we think about it, don't expect yourself to be happy all the time. And, I don't know how many listeners are aware, but I think it's important to mention, I'm in the Boston area, and in the New York area last week, there were 2 very high-profile suicides.
Mm-hmm.
And I bring this up because I think that we expect ourselves to be happy all the time, and that is totally unrealistic, and that is not what I mean when I talk about happiness. So when I talk about happiness, it's really about feeling a level of satisfaction with your life. So happiness is an emotion. It's fleeting. Some days we feel happy, some days we don't. When I talk about happiness and really feeling satisfaction with life, it really comes from a combination of working at the intersection of your interests, your values, and your strengths. So, if you're starting your own business, if you have your own business, and what you're doing has meaning to you, and it aligns with your values and what you're good at, then you are going to feel that what you're doing is important and has meaning. That brings happiness, an inner peace, an inner harmony. That's what I mean by happiness. It's not the smiley face happiness emoji, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what I'm trying to say and what I talk about in the book.
That's powerful. Thank you for sharing that, especially about, I assume you're talking about Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain in the past. Yes, a couple of weeks. I did an episode about that too, just this one about this, about happiness, and especially this perception, I think, on social media, or like you said, the smiley faces and these kind of things we think really represent happiness, but what does it really mean, and how do we define it for ourselves? And then for the women, for the women listening, as I've said before, if you feel like you are in a low place where you cannot get happy or be happy or feel happy at any point, there are places you can go or call to get help. And I'll make sure I have a link to that number and all of those things in case anyone's listening who you don't feel like you can find that happiness or define that happiness. So thank you for sharing.
Can I just mention one other thing?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I would say to that, and I was just listening to a podcast from the Greater Good Science Center at Berkeley University, is if you make a list of people in your life that you feel supported by, who would you rather spend time with than anyone else? Who are the people you go to when you have a problem that you can trust, like as your go-to people? What do those people have in common with each other? Just making that list and bringing them to mind, and knowing that you can call them when you're feeling, if you're feeling down, if you're feeling like you're having a bad day. Just know that you're not alone. And if you're feeling like you do need help, reach out to someone and don't feel ashamed or embarrassed. It's really, there is no shame or embarrassment in it at all.
That's right. I like that idea. Make a list and just sometimes seeing in front of you people who are there, who support you, knowing that they're there, and then knowing that you can reach out to them.
Yes.
And for anyone who's listening, I looked up the number. I'll have it in the show notes and everything, of course, since we did talk about suicide. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-8255. So 1-800-273-TALK. If you feel like you were in that space and you want to just talk it through with someone, that's there. And then, as Susan mentioned, making that list too of people in your life who support you. And you have to, that's what we're all about here, Susan. Support is sexy.
Yeah, it certainly is.
It certainly is. What would you say that entrepreneurship has taught you about yourself as a woman?
It's taught me that I'm stronger than I ever realized.
Mm-hmm.
I always lived in a kind of narrow, cautious place. And I realized that I'm a lot stronger and a lot braver than I ever thought possible. And without taking that chance on entrepreneurship, I don't think I would have known that.
So in closing, if you think over your life and career, and you had the chance to thank only one person whose support was critical to you personally or professionally, who would that be and what would you say?
Oh my goodness. That's such a hard question. I don't know. I probably would thank my mother. So my mother died at a very early age, and she did not get to live the dreams that she had for herself. And I think that I would thank her because I think she inspired me somewhere, somehow, this zest for learning and to be the best possible person that I could be is something that she instilled in me at a very early age. And I think that I've lived this in honor of her because she didn't have the opportunity to do it.
Beautiful, beautiful, Susan. Thank you for sharing that with us.
My pleasure.
Now, what are the ways that we can support you? As I mentioned, I'll have links to the website and all that great stuff, but tell everyone again, the website, any social media or anything else you want us to know about.
So my website again is Positive Workplace Partners. And Elayne, as you mentioned, I have 2 free ebooks on my website. So anyone listening is more than welcome to download those ebooks. I'm on LinkedIn, and I would love if you connect with me on LinkedIn to let me know, to just send me a note if you want to connect with me, to say that you heard me on Support is Sexy, because I love to know where people did hear me and how you know about me. I'm also on Twitter at Susan Peppercorn. So any of those places are fine. I would love to hear from you. I also have a Facebook page, Positive Workplace. And my book is available on Amazon. It's Ditch Your Inner Critic at Work. So I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me wherever is most convenient.
Excellent. So everyone listening, make sure you connect with Susan and tell her where you heard about her. We love to support our guests here. And on LinkedIn, is your name Susan Peppercorn?
Yes, it is.
Business? Okay. So we'll make sure we link to all of those. Susan, thank you so much. This was so awesome. I really appreciate you sharing your story and then all of your incredible advice.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been a blast.
Of course. Now, before you go, what's a parting piece of advice from you to our listeners about anything?
Oh, I would say if you've tested an idea that you have with people you trust and you've gotten encouragement, go for it. You don't have to be perfect. Good enough is good enough. That's advice that a wonderful teacher gave to me, Tal Ben Shahar. Just remember that. Good enough is good enough, and go for it.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Susan and got some great tips from her. Good enough is good enough, and go for it. Let me know what you think about this episode. I would love to hear back from you. Let me know what advice resonated with you, if any at all. You can find me on social media at Elayne Fluker at Support is Sexy. If you post this on Instagram stories, make sure you tag me. I've been missing a lot of the stories. I see them late, but make sure you tag me so I can see that you're listening there, and let me know what you thought if this was helpful. Myself and Susan. Tag Susan too at Susan Peppercorn. All right. So thank you again for listening. And if you want to find out more about Susan, how to work with her, find out more about positive workplace partners, just go to supportissexypodcast.com, go to that search icon at the top and type in Susan, Susan. Her show notes page will come up with the links and the resources and the ways to get in touch with her. Supportissexypodcast.com and search Susan. Now, until we chat again, what I want you to remember, all of the great advice that Susan gave us, but also that you deserve support. And I'll talk to you soon. Take care.